Welcome to Talk NYC's 2023 Spring Showcase or mid-year celebration of documentary film and series. I'm Ruth Somalo. I'm a senior features programmer at Talk NYC, and we will be bringing you some insight into the Hulu docuseries Stolen Youth today. We're speaking with director and executive producer, Zach Heinzerling. Hello, Zach.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for joining us. So I am a huge fan of your film Cutie and the Boxer, totally different beast. Then you moved to like music center projects, like the self-titled, like with Beyonce and McCartney 321. So tell us a little bit about how did you get involved with true crime and in this project in particular? And at what point in the chronology of events did you came on board?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I didn't really see it as true crime, and I don't know. I guess it is in that there was a crime and it's a true story. I think the word true crime, because there's so much of it, I think in the doc space, it sort of gets generalized and certain attributes, styles, formats, seem to lend themselves with the true crime of today. So I think when the project first came to me through Daniel Levin, who was one of the survivors who spoke for the New York Magazine piece. So I had read that article, which honestly was a bit shocking, of course, but left a lot to explain, left a lot on the table, left a lot of the sort of backstory and context and who were these people. The facts of the case are so strange, most of them. Larry's background, just the idea that he was living in the dorm, that this happened at a prestigious liberal arts school near New York City, that they were in this apartment in the Upper East Side, for years and years, and no one found out about this. It was all so crazy that it was sort of hard to know, how to step in to that world. I think my introduction through Daniel, brought me there with the connection I had to him, and we sort of, I felt like it could have been me. I felt like I could have been one of these students. I went to a liberal arts school and was sort of interested in, the arts and seeking answers and trying to, figure out who I was. And the anxieties and depressions that these students had are much like, any 18, 19-year-old has at this point in their life. I think Sarah Lawrence is a place that encourages a kind of independent thinking and sort of dissuades, making structural life decisions too early. So I think, all of this spoke to me personally, and I really related to Daniel's story. I didn't know sort of how deep the well or the tunnel was. I think that that's very common in documentary, common and certainly in Cutie and the Boxer. Where you start is obvious. It looks completely different than where you end up, and in this case, it was sort of, in some ways akin to a sort of you're digging into this tunnel, you're investigating a story, and the world just became more and more complicated, and in some ways, darker and darker. When the article came out, a lot of the kind of more disturbing details of the crime and the case, weren't public. And so, I met Daniel. He told me his story, but he was with Larry for 2 years. It wasn't until I met Isabella and Felicia and the Rosarios that I sort of, gained the full spectrum and multiple perspectives on what is, one of the most disturbing and harrowing stories that I certainly have ever come across. So yeah, it was a little bit about how I got started and with the project.
So because of what you said and the way that you interjected the story and you make that, kind of like empathetic, very empathetic portrait, I think the series has been really praised by the New York Times and many other media outlets as being, very sensible towards the victims in this case. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about maybe how did you had these initial conversations with the protagonist, and how did you work with them to earn their trust and to help them through a potentially very traumatic part in their lives, and potentially in a process that could be either very helpful or traumatizing for them. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about working with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think most of the people that they encountered during this experience, they had a hard time feeling a kind of relatable empathy from. One of the main reasons to do the project was because most of these victims were essentially, if not fully, partially blamed for this experience. I mean, when you hear about brainwashing, you hear about coercive control, um, the public still doesn't quite understand it, and there's a level of victim blaming, whether you know through the way that they're asked questions, how could you let this happen, for example, um, to them feeling just a level of embarrassment and shame, for having been quote unquote conned, by this person. So I think there was a real need to understand this from the point of view of the survivors. Oftentimes I'm asked, like, why aren't there experts in the series? And I do think there's a real place for that. And I had a lot of conversations with cult specialists and interventionalists and therapists throughout this process. But it was really important that the audience understand that these individuals are completely capable of diagnosing Larry, of understanding what happened to them, of explaining it in really explaining these really complex issues, like gaslighting and love bombing, in an intelligent and understandable way, to the public. Is a part of, for them, this was about or actually really taking ownership over their story, which had been, first stolen by Larry, and then, it became a big story in the press. So then their story was then retold through the press, and other documentaries came out, and so I think there was an effort to say, okay, this is going to be a survivor-led story, and they really appreciated that. They didn't want their story told by other people. So, like, part of the sort of, getting them on board was a little bit of a snowball effect. Well, like, Daniel starts, and then, some of the others were just interested in the way that this felt different from other media, other press. And then it's time, there's just, you have to spend a lot of time. I mean, any documentary filmmaker, of course, knows about, building trust and relationships. And this was just another example of that, in a territory that was very charged and, extremely, triggering. So of course, me and everyone on the film, really wanted this to be an example of a progression in this form of storytelling, where the subjects are really, allowing you this privileged access, into their lives, and um, you and the team really, you have to, you know, do your research, and B, it really has to be an experience that's valuable for them. That's one they can really get behind and in almost enjoy the process of, because the subject matter is so traumatizing. And that took a long time for them to sort of, get to that place of figuring out, am I really doing this for me? What's interesting about this? I think for a lot of them it was another form of therapy, not in any way comparing myself to a therapist, but just hearing yourself talk about something that you're trying to figure out. You're kind of questioning your thoughts as you speak, and it allows you to sort of rebuild a version of yourself, and that's essentially, this is an entire exercise in Larry had twisted their sense of who they were, and them speaking to me was a form of them kind of re-engaging in their own story and galvanizing their sense of themselves. So I think, again, it is about relationship building, but also understanding that that they really have to be doing it for themselves, and there can't be a pretense, and you have to make the power dynamics super explicit and understood up front, so that that you're just ahead of the potential for things that they are easily triggered by, coercion, extortion, etc. So I would love at some point almost to do a project or write something kind of based on documentary ethics and interviewing subjects of trauma, because so much of that work is not in the documentary. It's all sort of behind the scenes stuff, but it's really, really interesting. And this is a case study that I think other people in media can learn from, and both that I'm interested in learning more about as a result of this, and vice versa. So anyway, sorry to ramble on about that, but there's a lot there, obviously.
No, that's great, and it's so necessary. I would really love for you to do that case study. I think is the right moment. Also, like films like Subject, and like conversations about
Right.
ethics in the way we deal and treat the protagonist of the films that we're making is super important. And to that extent as well, you work with a group of friends that were like a very tight-knit family for a minute, and they really have deep appreciation for each other, but they were also victims of each other's kind of like collateral damage in a way. And it's a very interesting and very necessary that each one of their individual testimonies allows us to get a richer and deeper picture of the other protagonists, because they were all friends and they were able to see each other from the outside, probably much more than themselves. So
Totally.
to that extent, how did you organize that, like in terms of in a way, for the filmmakers out there, like production? Like, did you have like main interviews for like a couple of days? Did you have protagonists that you followed through a long time, and then some of them that just came in to kind of like counterpoint certain things that you were looking for? How did that work out in the work with each one of the protagonists?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, there were sort of clear lines of communication that had to be rigidly defined up front, because certain individuals were still under Larry's coercion when I met them. It was very important for me not to share any details of their lives with any of the other individuals. So it was very much and again, a privileged position to be in as a journalist, to be hearing conversations from people in that state, which is sort of uncharted territory for me, because I mean, it's slightly a different topic, which I'd be happy to talk about. But as far as lines of communication, you sort of establish a trust first with me as someone interested in telling a empathetic, you know, and more complex version of their story. And then second, you know, what are the sort of rules of our communication? And, you know, so for some of the interviews, you know, we would, you know, because it would make them more comfortable for them basically to have no one present besides me, you know, we would bring the crew in, set up the interview, and then essentially I would be the only one in the room, and I would control, you know, the recording device, and you know, make it very obvious when and when we were not recording for the subject. And you know, then we would take breaks, go for a walk, the crew would come in and, you know, change tape or whatever, and then we would start again. And that was, you know, what they preferred. Other you know, individuals preferred to meet the crew, you know, meet the crew and understand, you know, who was a part of this project, and you know, so that there, you know, just was a sense of everyone sort of being on board. And um, so you know, everyone sort of had different preferences. And you know, as far as lines of communication, it really, you know, we were basically sort of in these siloed, um, you know, relationships that sort of came together in the film. And then only once the subject survivors saw the film, you know, did they sort of understand, you know, the to what you're saying, the level of understanding that this sort of multi-perspective narrative can provide. And I think, you know, another sort of behind the scenes moment was just getting to sort of listen to these revelations that these individuals were having as they watched this series, which was one of the things that I think Daniel really wanted out of this, was for someone to be able to watch this and learn something about themselves. You know, whether they were still maybe tied to Larry in some way or still feeling shame or embarrassment, you know, how, you know, what a strengthening process and a relief, to sort of see these other individuals who can share in that narrative and, you know, really validate what you have to say and what you're thinking, and also encourage you to go further with whatever process, you know, you're on. So that was really, you know, one of the most kind of rewarding experiences for me and those that worked on the film, was that what we were making was somehow also, you know, helping in their recovery process. You know, because I think especially in true crime, you know, you're just constantly, or I was constantly worried about, like, why is this, you know, why is this good? I mean, A, why is this good for the world? And B, is it good for the people that are having to retell these stories? So, you know, I think, again, it's just like constant communication and being in front of, you know, potential, you know, issues that might arise from, you know, communication lines that are crossed. And you know, again, I think it was a learning experience ultimately for me. But you know, in the end, I think what was important were that the survivors really felt heard and listened to, and that their sort of, you know, initial desires were maintained throughout, and ended up having a really positive experience in the end. So that was great.
And I think to that extent that we can really identify with the protagonist, it's important that the show really let us understand the ways in which Larry was charming and helpful to the group initially, because like we need to understand how this intelligent, vibrant group of people really fell for his tactics. Like you said, you know, it could have happened to you. You know, like I've done like a million workshops on like things that could sound like some of the things that Larry was initially talking about. So and then you have like these other characters. Like I think Raven is a very important character because she kind of like saw right through Larry from the start. So how did you kind of crafted that tension? So at least momentarily, you know, there is a suspension of disbelief, and we believe that this character was that kind of like really alluring, you know, father figure that we would have all fell for.
Yeah, it was really hard. And I would say that was probably one of the hardest aspects of this project, was that when you look at the surface, most people's reaction is this guy, like how, like, I just, they just can't understand, I mean, his mugshot was posted all over the news, and, he presents as a sort of, schlubby, like unattractive, he has this thick Staten Island accent. And here you have these like brilliant, you know, students going to this prestigious university, and it was just like most people's reaction was like, what? Like, I don't get it. And so honestly, like the the test for us was like, if the biggest sort of hurdle, and the one that we have to surmount in order for this to really help others empathize with these students, which is the top priority for this project, is to get an understanding of Larry when they met him, the Larry that they knew, which is very different than the Larry that you see a mugshot of on the news. And I mean, honestly, it was like, I still, I still see reactions that are like, how did this happen, from the documentary. For us, it was about, using the archival that we had, the audio archival, that sort of presents him in this kind of guru self-help figure. He's talking about philosophy, he's talking about, like, shedding these layers of your sort of artifice to get to the real you. Sometimes it's presented, like he had these slideshows of these sort of like, quest for potential. And then other times it's a little bit more, in sort of like a one-on-one conversation, like Daniel in the Starbucks, where, he's meant to just answer questions that are dragging you down in a very clear and decisive black and white way, which really was an emotionally uh, transformative experience for these students who've been weighed down by this anxiety and depression. So I think through the audio and then through some of the anecdotes, you do get a version of a charming and helpful Larry. The other thing we did was we just avoided sort of showing images of him, that were, there weren't a lot of images of him, but he sort of became this kind of mysterious, you know, sort of presence in the dorm. And we did recreations where, it was, they were mostly emotional in the sort of language to sort of, you know, put you in the space more than a literal, image of this person who you might judge, on the surface as, not like someone that would find interesting as a college student. And that was a conscious choice to sort of avoid, seeing him too much. Images of him. I mean, the images that we do use are him in sort of his military outfits, and with other prominent, figures, Giuliani and Bernard Kerik. And yeah, I could see myself, just as any number of these individuals. It's like, sort of right place, right time in a lot of ways. And certainly being open to someone who was, expounding on these stories of sort of like, insane, proportions of the CIA and FBI, and then having the sort of proof to show, that it was real. And Santos was a big, history buff. That Larry could talk about, Finnegan's Wake, quote lines from books that Daniel was interested in. So for each of the individuals, he sort of had a key, for whatever that need was. So we sort of tried to show the variety of the mechanisms that he used. For Raven, she had a previous experience with someone just like Larry. And I think that's one thing also that we tried to emphasize is when you're 18, 19, like you haven't had those experiences that allow what Larry was doing to be a red flag. So those aren't red flags yet because you haven't had enough life experience to understand, oh, this is a manipulative individual who's doing this for selfish means. And so I think, that was one thing. I think it's understanding what it means to be 18, 19, and then understanding what Larry was like at that time, which was a genuinely charismatic individual. I met Larry much later in life, and there was no, I couldn't see any charisma. I couldn't really see, any of the sort of personality traits that some of these individuals, and people ask me, why didn't I interview him? And I did. I just didn't use it because it was actually detrimental to the focus of and goal of the film, which was to empathize with these individuals when they met him. If you had seen this interview with Larry, it would just further, entrench this idea of this, like, how could this guy, like, why would you fall for this guy? Which is, honestly, most of the kind of responses that really are so harmful to these individuals, and that the project was trying to educate those, so the naivety would lessen.
And to that extent, I think it was so important that we get to see the reconciliation between Santos and his sisters, Yalitza and Felicia, and their parents, because it seems like it happened as you guys were filming and you were accompanying Felicia in this process. So can you tell us a little bit about how was this like delicate balance of like watching Felicia trying to deprogram herself as we are watching in real time and being part of the project as it's developing?
Yeah, I mean, it was really, it's hard to describe, I guess. It happened over the course of about a year. I would say it was, for me, certainly an experience unlike any other. And again, one of these privileged experiences of being a documentary filmmaker, being able to, step foot in someone's life for a period of time and understand what that's like. And, I think I didn't really have an idea of what direction Felicia or Isabella would go when I started filming with them. And honestly, it was probably I was my goal was to listen. My goal was to understand them where they were. I had spoken to cult experts about the sort of deprogramming process, and one of the keys is sort of just meeting people where they are. If you show judgment or try to sort of push in one direction, you'll immediately be exposed as a sort of dissenter, an enemy, in their minds, or in Larry's mind. It's all about sort of preventing that kind of divergence of thought and opening of the mind. And so I think I would present in a very unbiased way, and ask questions, and ask questions about those questions. A lot of it is talking about talking. Why are you responding in that way? So then there's this need to sort of question what they're saying, which is new, because it's mostly like a script. And I think in the process of them sort of, answering these questions, you know, they had to question their answers to those questions internally. And that's where you start to see, the seeds of kind of change. And of course, without Larry, because Larry was in jail, or he was awaiting trial, but he was in a holding facility. So without Larry, they had the freedom to kind of question their answers. And so I didn't know how long this was going to go on, and I think, for Alicia, it would look like, I would get a phone call and she would be like, I want to see my parents. And I would, it was like, wow, incredible. Okay. That's amazing. And, then I would sort of hear more about that. And so it was, I think one of the sort of takeaways is just how, sort of malleable our minds are and our memories are, and in the same way that they can be, sort of twisted in a manipulative way, they can rebuild and regrow and progress in a positive way. And I think even Isabella now, I mean, sort of, by the time she was starting to sort of shift, I wasn't able to film with her because she was in a legal position, that sort of made it, impossible to continue, and had been, indicted and charged with a felony. But you see, in what's happening with her, and that she's making this turn and is recovering as well. And um it's just sort of, a testament to, you know the kind of space that, uh that this sort of psychology, the psychology of, um not only young people. Felicia was 30, when she met Larry, and the same memory manipulation was happening. But this space of sort of understanding coercive control, and how real it is, and how easy it is something that we just, as a society and culture, need to really focus on understanding, because you're seeing this happening everywhere, in much sort of, less severe gradations. And I think for me, it was a completely eye-opening experience of, wow, like, someone could literally change your identity through changing your memories. They can make you a different person. Isabella was completely changed by Larry into a different person, capable of doing things, criminal things that she never would have before. And then so it just makes you think of, okay, what are all the gradations of that, that happen in society every day, and how can we understand, you know both the sort of red flags and tactics of a manipulative narcissist like Larry, um, but also just, the vulnerability that everyone has, to that sort of, person. And then also in Felicia's, instance, the ability that we have to, recover, and that change is possible. I think when you're in these situations, it does feel like there's no way out, that there's no escape, that I could never go back on the identity that I've now changed. All the things that I've said to all these people, my family, my friends, that I've spent so much energy, um, you know, changing myself, for this person, that I could never go back on that. And that was the mindset, the sunken cost, is too great. And that's the mindset that sort of keeps you in. So I think, and to some extent, the way out, seeing that, and experiencing it, I think can help, others, others, do the same, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, I just think there's so much more understanding we have to do in this space, and hopefully it leads to less prevalence of this kind of behavior, because there's no shortage of these stories, of cult stories. We see more and more every day, and I'm sure there'll be more of these sort of docu-series, but hopefully they're more informed, and that we're getting to a deeper level of understanding, and less of the kind of shock of how could this happen, which is honestly probably responsible for a lot of the problem in the first place.
Hopefully all those series would get directors as empathetic and sensible as you, because this is like very tricky when we're talking about this kind of level of ethics and involvement with people that are going through very difficult things. So thank you so much for sharing with us today, Zach, and thank you so much to everyone at home watching.
Yeah, thank you for watching, and thanks for your interest in the series, and for the conversation.